You call that directing?
That is what I've been calling it for 32 years.
Why, there are values and dimensions in that scene you haven't begun to hit.
Perhaps they're not the values and dimensions I wish to hit. I could make this scene a climax. I could make every scene in this picture a climax. If I did, I would be a bad director. And I like to think of myself as one of the best. A picture, all climaxes, is like a necklace without a string. It falls apart. You must build to your big moment. And sometimes you must build slowly.
Look, when I want to lecture on the aesthetics of motion pictures, I'll ask for it.
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, we're going to be looking at two major corporations that more or less define what it means to be in show business. The first of them is the Walt Disney Company, and the second is Netflix. Both of them are going through rather large changes. Both of them are getting a lot of press because of those changes, and both of those companies' changes aren't necessarily everything that they're played out to be in the press. So let's start with Disney because that's the one that seems to be riding high. Please check in the box below to see links to the two articles that I'm going to refer to. This article about Iger begins with more or less saying that he's riding high on his career and that he's top of the world. And in a lot of ways, he really is. He's closed a major deal for Walt Disney with 20th Century Fox. He's done a lot of acquisitions, and the Disney company is a major powerhouse throughout Hollywood. In fact, with the acquisition of Fox, it now owns pretty much 40% of the industry. But there are consequences to that size, and there are especially consequences to that size when you're someone like Robert Iger. Now, Bob Iger is someone who, when he was an executive over at ABC, was a good guy. He was someone who understood content a little bit, but he also understood the business a lot. And in fact, he is that type of an executive. He's someone who is great at being an executive. He's great in the boardroom. He's great at talking to stock investors and all of that. But where he's lacking and where Fox in general in the past, whether it be Darryl F. Zanuck or later Rupert Murdoch, always was a leader, was that they were always entrepreneurial. They were always taking risks. They were not risk averse. In fact, they almost relished the opportunity to take a risk and run it all for the chance at a big success. Iger's the opposite of that. Iger's someone who is very measured. He makes sure that he is covered. He makes sure that he doesn't spend any more capital than he absolutely needs to. And while that's great for boardrooms and while that's great for Madison Avenue, it's not necessarily that great for a company that's now as large as the Walt Disney Company is. And because of that, there's a general sense that Iger might be in over his head. And even though he's been running it for a while, even though he's brought in Lucasfilm and Pixar and Marvel Comics and all of that, there's still a sense that he is not maximizing those assets. Let's take a look at what Disney has done with the Star Wars franchise. Okay, they paid $4 billion for this. And yes, it's legacy. Yes, it's old. Yes, it has this tremendous following. And in an attempt to bring in a newer audience, to revamp the series, Disney, with Kathleen Kennedy and with Rian Johnson and with J.J. Abrams, went against what the original series was based on. And yes, you can say that, oh, it's 40 years old, and times have changed. But they haven't changed that much. And we can just look at what happened with Solo and what happened after The Last Jedi to see this level of anger that's coming from the original fans. And this is important. The original fans were not willingly replaced by new fans. The new people who were going to the movies, even if they made money initially, weren't loving it. And by alienating their core, I do see that the Star Wars franchise is at a do or die. Now, maybe Disney will just say, okay, that was a wrong investment. How can you say that to something that was such a cultural icon? It's just bizarre. Ditto for Marvel Comics. Now, with Disney's acquisition of Fox, it's now gained a lot of pieces of the Marvel Universe. And so its ability to take that franchise forward into the future is completely unambiguous. But one of the things that they want to do in order to bring Marvel into the future is to create new comics. So we have new characters and thereby build new stars and maybe build new franchises. Here's the challenge for that. The comic books have been dying. They've been having a lot of struggles. And because they've been having a lot of struggles, they're not inspiring new comic book fans. And while the general attitude to that might be, well, who cares? Because Marvel movies have to go beyond just the comic book fans. But when you don't service your core fans, you are asking for trouble down the line. So now we have two companies that have been somewhat problematic under Disney's tutelage. The third company that's been somewhat problematic of recent is ABC. Now, even though ABC is legacy media and it's something where a lot of people look at it and they go, well, who cares? That's broadcast TV. But with almost glacial slowness, we have seen that broadcast TV, just like cable news networks, have been experiencing a little bit of a surprise. They're starting to once again pull in somewhat younger viewers. Now, that might not sound like much because it's still very tertiary, but one of the reasons that the networks, the broadcast networks, are starting to pull in new people is because network programming, being as advertiser-based, being as weekly appointment viewing based as it is, tends to spin very positively. Now, I'm not anyone to knock something like Game of Thrones. I think it's one of those shows that you just look at and say, wow. But it also negatively spins. So do most of the things on HBO and Netflix originals. So while those can be very exciting to watch in a binge, they don't necessarily make you feel good about the world. They don't necessarily make you want to come back next week as an appointment view. TV at its best is bringing people into your home and allowing them to become part of your family. Who wants to be a family with any of those people? And it's for that reason on TV detective shows and cop procedurals, even if there's a challenge sometimes, justice usually wins. In the medical shows, no matter what kind of drama the doctors have, they do their best, even if sometimes their best isn't good enough. It's still a positive spin. Say nothing of sitcoms where it's like, yeah, I really want these people to be my neighbors because they're a lot of fun. ABC threw away two of its hits. It threw away Last Man Standing and it threw away The Roseanne Show. Now, yes, you could say that Roseanne is crazy and she shot off her mouth and she shouldn't have done that. But that was their number one show. You don't cancel your number one show until you're sure it's damaging your brand. And they didn't do that. They canceled it without thinking about what the repercussions were. And that was a mistake. And that's a mistake that Iger seems to be making continually. Iger reminds me of, okay, I'm kind of guilty of this myself, as someone who is too old to really partake in social media easily. Those of us who are over a certain age have to be careful because we come from the analog world. So we're bringing a lot of stuff to digital that might be an overemphasis. And I think what's happened is that Iger is looking at tweets, not really understanding that you self-curate them and that you can create your own echo chamber. And so he and a lot of his executives are thinking they're making the correct decisions for the public at large, and actually what they're doing is they're alienating big parts of the population. This is not a smart move from a business standpoint. We already saw what happened when Gillette did that. We've already seen what happens when other companies decide to go out there and make a political statement, because you're by definition going to alienate half of your buyers. And ultimately, that's a mistake. And ultimately, that's what's been happening with the Walt Disney Company. Now, here's the other challenge that Disney has. It's that it's not creative. It doesn't take risks, and they've got to. If you don't take a risk, you're not going to ever get a big reward. You can't always buy your next revenue increase, and that's what Iger's been doing. So they've taken on a tremendous amount of risk. Now, the reason he's a Wall Street darling for the moment is it looks like he's going to go force grill and center against Netflix. And sure, Netflix is a very damaged target that's kind of weak. So Disney Plus going out there and saying that we're going to be cheaper than them and we're going to have a larger library would be a great piece of news if Disney's claim that they were going to do something like 25 new series and do a bunch of new movies had behind it some names or some projects that sounded like they were filling in gaps that weren't being covered already on the Netflix end. And sure, one of the benefits they're going to have is they own a lot of legacy material, including cartoons, including kids shows, and yes, it'll hurt Netflix when those are gone, but they must also do good new programming. And I'm not sure that looking at what Disney's been doing and its original programming that's non-franchise stuff has been something that I have big trust in. Now, let's look at why Netflix is a prime target. Netflix is a prime target because it was, in a hideous way, too successful for its own good. What they did is they destroyed the physical media market without realizing that licensing everything, not having physical copies of it, could eventually mean that those licenses go away. And what happens when a license goes away? You no longer own it. So now that 40% of the legacy content in Hollywood is owned by Disney, Netflix is at a position where it doesn't have access to that content anymore. And yes, some wag might say, well, so who cares? It's just a bunch of old movies that no one cares about. Yes and no, because there's a lot of bread and butter content there that fills people in between launching new shows. Yes, Netflix has a ton of subscribers, and it keeps increasing, but most of their subscribers are no longer coming out of the US, and that's a problem because most of their content still has to ultimately appeal first and foremost to US buyers. And what's happening is that they're now relying on fickle income streams coming from areas that, if they do the wrong thing, could go away. Plus, how many series are people actually binge watching top to bottom now? I don't think it's what it used to be. First, the novelty has worn off. And with the novelty wearing off, all you can replace it with is quality. Netflix, on the one hand, does have a lot of quality because they pay for it. Just like Carol Co. in the late 80s and early 90s was one of the biggest film production companies because they paid more than anyone else. They created the $20 million payday for first for Sylvester Stallone, then Arnold Schwarzenegger. Then they spent the first $100 million on a movie that had a lot of CGI, which was, of course, Terminator 2. And you would think that they had put themselves into a great position. They did, but they took on a tremendous amount of debt. And that amount of debt, with nothing other than movie revenues coming in, ultimately doomed them when the market changed, when there was some financing scandals with one of their big financiers, and when, and this is important, they had two tremendous flops back to back. They were reliant on every one of their movies being the next Terminator 2 or Basic Instinct. And then they came out with Showgirls and Cutthroat Island, and it was done. They could not keep up the illusion anymore of them being on the avant-garde. This is what is happening with Netflix. They are still spending tremendous amounts of money, but a large number of their series are not getting people to binge the entire series. There's a lot of series that end with people watching maybe half and then stopping. And this is a problem with the way their content is done. And there's really no way to fix it. Even if you're on a show on HBO like Game of Thrones, let's say that they did something that was really jumping the shark, they could actually go back, because it's run weekly, they can actually go back and tweak it. Maybe not the next episode, but from a couple episodes down, and maybe turn it around by the end of the season. When you're doing something that's a binge, if you screw up in episode 2, you're done. That means you have 8 completed episodes that are going to have marginal viewership and are going to have no tail for reruns in the future. And plus, now you don't have a lot of competition for reruns. Moreover, Disney Plus is not the only competition they have. You have Amazon, you have Hulu. Well, okay, Disney owns 60% of Hulu. But you have other choices. And with those other choices, the article claims that people will just have 4 or 5 streaming services. I got bad news for them. Not everyone lives in West LA and considers middle class being that you make $1 million a year. No, for a lot of people, they're going to buy one streaming service. And yes, that one streaming service, if it has a lot of cartoons, will probably be Disney, just because they have family programming. So Netflix is in kind of a rough area. But again, I think Iger might be doing his victory lap a bit early too. So I love movies. I love television. This industry has been my life. And even though it's a sign of old age that every time you turn around, you're always acting like something's worse than it's ever been. I'm not saying it's worse than it's ever been. I'm just saying that unlike previous times when I've witnessed changes, when I witnessed first-run syndication going away, when I witnessed the collapse of home video and all that, there was always an alternative. There was always a venue for improving things. I'm not seeing it now. That doesn't mean anything, because that just means that it's out there and it just hasn't manifested yet to me. But I do have concerns that for the short term, things can get more problematic than better. But that's Hollywood.
Shelve the picture? Are you crazy? We can't do that.
Why not?
Look, Jonathan, we're a hawk to the banks up to our necks. We went way over budget. We've got to release it.